A muffled explosion, a blinding white light swallows the entire screen. What follows is absolute silence. Seconds pass. Then, a terrifying earthquake, not one from nature, but from a massive underground explosion. It shakes the vast expanse of the Gobi Desert. At the Strategic Command Center in Beijing, red alarms blare all at once. Seismic data confirms a deep underground blast, equivalent to a tactical nuclear weapon. But the unthinkable is their pride, the S-400 air defense system, the multi-layered HQ-9 shield, all stayed silent. No early warning. Not a single interceptor missile was launched. Their satellites only captured a massive heat spot before the signal was completely jammed. Beijing was stunned. How could AI have penetrated the firewall of the world's densest air defense network? While the Western Theater Command was still paralyzed, 5 minutes later, the White House spoke out. The voice was firm, cold, with no trace of hesitation. Washington declared they had just carried out a preemptive strike with absolute precision. The target, a top-secret research facility, buried more than 30 feet underground, accused of violating the treaty by developing a new generation of tactical nuclear weapons. The culprits behind this impossible strike, 3 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers. The whole world held its breath. This was not a drill. This was not a mere provocation. This was a direct act of war. America had delivered an unthinkable blow, shattering the defensive shield, once believed to be impenetrable by Beijing. Total war. A war between two nuclear superpowers, now hanging by a thread. The shockwave in the Gobi Desert was not an isolated event. It was the culmination of months of escalation that had been building in the Taiwan Strait. Our story begins when U.S. intelligence, through a vast network of assets, in space and covert intelligence sources, they obtained data that could not be ignored. Beijing, under immense pressure to achieve a military breakthrough, had been secretly pushing a project that Washington believed could completely shift the balance of power. It wasn't just an ordinary nuclear weapon. It was a small tactical nuclear warhead, capable of changing the entire game. Designed for use in an invasion scenario of Taiwan, a weapon powerful enough to crush defensive will, but small enough for China to believe the U.S. wouldn't dare retaliate with a full nuclear strike, a total one. For the Pentagon, this was the ultimate red line. The risk of not acting and letting China possess such a weapon was far greater than the risk of a preemptive strike. The U.S. president, after several tense sessions in the Situation Room, made a historic decision to destroy that facility at any cost. The plan was codenamed Spearhead. The chosen strike force was not Tomahawk missiles from submarines, nor F-35s from aircraft carriers, because the target was too deep inland, protected by an integrated air defense network, the densest on the planet. There was only one weapon in America's arsenal, capable of absolute stealth, carrying an enormous payload and flying across the globe. To execute this mission, the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, 3 B-2s from the 509th Bomb Wing, silently took off from Whiteman Air Force Base. Each carried 2 GBU-57 MOP bunker-busting bombs. This was no ordinary bomb. It was a giant, weighing over 30,000 pounds, specially designed to pierce 200 feet of reinforced concrete before detonating. But the B-2s didn't act alone. This strike was a symphony of 21st century warfare. Hours before the stealth bombers entered Chinese airspace, an invisible cyber war had already begun. China's early warning satellites suddenly received a flood of false data. Their long-range warning radars, designed to detect stealth aircraft, were attacked by algorithms, causing precise electronic confusion from U.S. Space Force space-based assets. At the same time, a top-secret stealth drone, possibly an RQ-180 White Hawk, flying at extreme altitude, had penetrated first to map in detail the blind spots and temporary gaps in the opponent's network. In the air defense grid, the B-2s, which already have a radar cross-section the size of an insect, were now guided along a route where they were virtually invisible. The 40-hour flight was an extreme test of psychological and technological endurance. The B-2 pilots flew under total radio silence. They crossed the Pacific, were refueled repeatedly in midair. Under the most secret conditions, they did not fly straight to the target. They flew in arcs, using the Earth's shadow. They hugged the terrain in astonishing fashion, As they neared enemy territory, the decisive moment arrived when the lead B-2 entered the detection envelope of an S-400 complex. The aircraft's electronic warfare systems simultaneously triggered a storm on the operator's radar screens. The S-400 was suddenly saturated. Hundreds of false targets appeared and vanished. They were blind and deaf at the critical moment. The B-2s slipped through like true phantoms. One alert, one sound in the Samarkand sky. The bomb bay doors opened. 6 GBU-57 mops. 6 decisive spears were released in silence. They plunged with terrifying acceleration. The first 2 detonated on the surface, delivering a seismic punch to breach the outer protective layers. The next 4 were time-delayed by a few milliseconds to drive straight into the mouth of the newly formed crater. They pierced through more than 30 feet of rock and reinforced concrete when the final detonators were triggered at the depth precisely calculated by American engineers. The entire underground complex collapsed from within. A tightly contained explosion beneath the surface generated a man-made earthquake. Seconds passed. A terrifying quake, not of natural origin, but from an underground detonation of immense power, shaking the vast expanse of the Gobi Desert. America's intention was unmistakable. This was not an invasion. It was a surgical deterrent strike. A bloody message had been sent. Washington wanted to prove 3 things. First, nowhere in China's territory was truly safe. Second, America's global strike capability was real and unstoppable. Third, and most frightening for Beijing, master-level stealth technology, when combined with space warfare and cyber warfare, had rendered their expensive A2/AD defense systems utterly useless in humiliating fashion. China's shock was not just tactical surprise. It was a complete strategic shock. They had invested trillions of dollars in carrier-killer missiles like the DF-21D and DF-26, aimed at pushing U.S. fleets far from their shores. They had prepared for a war fought offshore, but were struck mercilessly. Deep within their own heartland, they had been breached by the B-2. This defeat exposed a flaw, unforgivable in their defense doctrine. Beijing's initial silence after the attack was not a silence of weakness or acceptance. It was the silence of a wounded predator, the silence of boundless fury, and of a strategic mind racing with vengeance. How would they retaliate? When and where? Because they knew, if they didn't strike back, every claim of being a rising superpower would become a mockery. The real crisis had only just begun. If the initial shock was disbelief, then the response that followed from Beijing was pure fury. A political earthquake erupted inside Zhongnanhai. An emergency overnight meeting was convened. Every military option was placed on the table. Retaliation with nuclear weapons was the first option to be ruled out. It would be suicide. It would trigger the mechanism of mutual assured destruction and end in global annihilation. China could not win a full-scale nuclear war, and they knew it, but they couldn't do nothing. Silence would mean surrender. It would mean accepting inferiority, accepting that the U.S. could strike anywhere, anytime it wanted. That would completely shatter the deterrence doctrine Beijing had built for decades. A decision was made. If they couldn't confront directly, they would strike back asymmetrically. A blow not against military strength, but against America's Achilles heel. 2 battlefronts were opened simultaneously. The first was invisible. The largest cyber war in human history. It was launched. Thousands of elite hacker units, state-sponsored and coordinated, moved into action simultaneously. The first target, Wall Street. The trading systems of the New York Stock Exchange suddenly froze. Data became corrupted. Chaos spread. Trillions of dollars in market value evaporated in minutes. A wave of panic spread across the entire global financial system. The second target, civil infrastructure. Dozens of servers controlling the Texas power grid, a vital U.S. energy hub, suddenly went offline. Transformers overloaded and exploded. Millions of Americans plunged into darkness. In the middle of a scorching summer, chaos erupted. The third target, military. The logistics system and coordination network of the U.S. 7th Fleet in Yokosuka, Japan, came under attack. Warship deployment orders became scrambled. Fuel and ammunition data were falsified. China's retaliation did not cause immediate bloodshed, but it struck directly at America's economic lifeline and its social stability. The second front, tangible on the sea. The Chinese Navy roared to life. Hundreds of warships, including both carrier strike groups, Liaoning and Shandong, left port simultaneously. They did not head toward the U.S. fleet. They sailed toward Taiwan. Beijing announced a live-fire exercise of unprecedented scale, completely encircling the island. Openly, they declared the establishment of a no-fly zone and a maritime exclusion zone across the entire Taiwan Strait. It was a de facto blockade. The message was crystal clear. The U.S. struck at our heartland. We will reclaim what is ours. And as the global chessboard trembled, a third major player decided it could no longer remain silent. Inside the Kremlin, Russian President Vladimir Putin convened the National Security Council. Intelligence reports were laid out on the table. For Moscow, the U.S. strike on China was not just a regional conflict. It was an act of state terrorism by Washington, a dangerously precedent-setting move. If today, America could unilaterally strike a Chinese nuclear facility, then tomorrow, it could do the same to Russia's missile silos. Putin saw both danger and opportunity. The danger, America's unchecked hegemony. The opportunity, far greater. This was a golden moment to tighten the alliance. A strategic alliance, with no limits alongside Beijing. This was an opportunity to directly challenge the unipolar order. And most importantly, it was a chance to test Russia's most advanced weaponry in a near-combat confrontation against the strongest opponent. The Kremlin didn't just condemn with words. An emergency joint defense pact between Moscow and Beijing was immediately activated. Hours later, Russia's Ministry of Defense they would deploy a special squadron to an airbase in western China under the pretext of supporting air defense training and sharing tactical data with their ally. That squadron was not composed of Su-35s, but of 6 fifth-generation stealth fighter jets, Russia's technological pride, the Su-57 Felon. The situation completely shifted. Now, Chinese airspace was protected not only by S-400 systems, but also by Russian predatory birds in the sky. The decisive battle the world feared most had finally begun. An F-22 Raptor, the king of the skies, took off from Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, Japan. Its mission? To conduct a high-altitude stealth reconnaissance flight, approaching Chinese airspace, to assess the actual damage from the Su-57 strike, and more importantly, to monitor the movements of the Chinese fleet encircling Taiwan. The F-22 pilot was confident in his ability to see without being seen. Suddenly, as the Raptor cruised at supersonic speed, Mach 1.5, a sharp ping echoed. The radar warning system screamed, "Locked." Hard lock. The pilot froze in disbelief. Impossible. His systems hadn't detected any radar emissions before. But what was more terrifying, the lock signal he was receiving wasn't coming from any known radar source. It wasn't the radar signature of an S-400, nor was it that of AJ-20 or AJ-10. The signal was Russian. From the clouds below, 2 Su-57 Felons burst upward through the air. They had been hunting the F-22, not with active radar, but using their infrared, search and track sensors. The OLS-50M, an electronic eye, specially designed to detect the heat signatures of stealth aircraft engines. This was the dream confrontation for every military analyst. The F-22, symbol of absolute stealth, with its see first, shoot first philosophy, versus the Su-57, a different design concept, combining stealth, supermaneuverability, and diverse sensor arrays. The supersonic aerial chase began. The F-22 tried to break away, using stealth to escape the target lock. But the 2 Su-57s, with incredible agility, constantly shifted position, keeping the Raptor within the field of their IRST systems. No shots were fired, no missiles launched. But the weapons bays of all 3 aircraft were hot and open. It was a high-altitude standoff at 50,000 feet. The F-22 pilot realized the mission was compromised, and facing a 2-on-1 disadvantage, was forced to abort and retreat toward Kadena. Russia's message was unmistakable. They weren't intervening with words. They had entered the conflict through direct military action. They had proven the Su-57's ability to detect the F-22. Any future U.S. strike on China would now face not only Beijing's air defenses, but also the Russian Bear. The strategic chessboard had flipped. Washington, once the hunter, now realized it was facing a true military alliance. The balance of power had completely changed. The aerial standoff between the F-22 and the Su-57 was a cold splash of reality for the Pentagon. The scenario was no longer the U.S. versus China, but the U.S. versus the Russia-China military alliance. The strategists in Washington immediately recognized a harsh truth. Any further direct military escalation, such as a second B-2 strike or deploying carriers into the Taiwan Strait, now carried an unacceptable risk. That risk was World War III. The B-2 strike was an absolute tactical success, but it triggered a strategic reaction that Washington had not anticipated. The swift and decisive intervention of the Russian bear now cornered the Pentagon. They couldn't retreat, because that would mean accepting defeat after launching the first strike. But they also couldn't advance militarily, because the cost would be global annihilation. Inside the Situation Room, a new decision was made. If they couldn't win on the military battlefield, they would change the entire battlefield. Washington's decisive move, its true game changer, was not another bomb. It was a double strike, aimed at what neither Beijing nor Moscow could defend against: their economies and technology. Phase 1, the financial nuclear option, was activated. Within 6 hours, the U.S. president, after a series of emergency calls with G7 and European Union leaders, appeared on television. His announcement was more terrifying than a declaration of war. Washington, together with its key allies, declared a complete freeze on China's foreign reserves, trillions of dollars worth of euros and yen that Beijing had painstakingly accumulated over decades, suddenly became worthless numbers. On computer screens, it was an economic strike, equivalent to the B-2 attack on the nuclear facility. It hit directly at the foundation of social stability, at Beijing's very lifeline. Their rice bowl, the Shanghai and Shenzhen stock markets, lost trillions of dollars. In just minutes, the yuan collapsed. A global financial panic began. Then came the second wave of sanctions, a direct strike at Moscow. The U.S. declared that any bank, institution, or nation found trading with or supporting China's military-industrial entities would be immediately cut off from the SWIFT network and banned from using the U.S. dollar. The Kremlin was stunned. They had sent Su-57s to China to showcase their military power and demonstrate strategic solidarity. Now they realized they'd been caught in the economic crossfire. Russia's already fragile economy now faced the threat of total isolation, all because of its intervention. Washington had forced Moscow to choose: either remain allied with a collapsing China or save itself. But the harshest strike was yet to come, as the world reeled from the financial storm. The Pentagon called an emergency press conference. Phase 2, the technological counterstrike. A high-ranking Air Force general took the podium. He didn't boast about the B-2 strike. He unveiled a video that, in his words, changes every calculation about the future of warfare. First, they revealed what China and Russia had never known. The B-2 strike's success was not solely due to 45-year-old stealth technology. It had been guided, escorted, and shielded by an AI drone squadron, the new generation loyal wingmen. These drones flew, using themselves to jam and blind S-400 radar systems at close range. The following footage was what truly shocked the world. It showed an aerial dogfight over the East China Sea. Two Su-57s were chasing an F-22. The imagery was crystal clear, down to every detail. But the angle wasn't from a satellite. It wasn't from the F-22 either. The general explained. This footage was transmitted live from a classified asset, a prototype of the State Route 72, the Ghost without a name, a hypersonic unmanned reconnaissance aircraft, flying at 100,000 feet at Mach 5 speed, while the two Su-57 pilots were celebrating, locking onto the F-22, far above them, in a layer of atmosphere their radars could never reach. An American AI was watching them, tracking every move, recording every technical parameter, every radar frequency. The F-22 wasn't the prey, it was the bait. And then came the technological checkmate. The general played one final clip. It showed one of the two Su-57s, parked on a runway at a Chinese airbase. After landing safely, the footage was so clear, you could see the ground crew, The general stated coldly. One of the stealth-loyal wingman drones had tailed the Su-57 all the way without the Russian pilot ever realizing it. Beijing and Moscow were speechless. China's defeat was total. Its economy, the foundation of its power, was collapsing under sanctions. Its strategic nuclear base was destroyed, and now they realized their trusted ally was no technological superior at all. Russia's humiliation was even deeper. Their proud Su-57, the so-called F-22 killer, had just been exposed, publicly and completely. It had been tracked and recorded by a weapon system they didn't even know existed. Moscow's intended to deter the U.S., had instead revealed their own deadly technological weakness and chained them to a collapsing economy. To China's sinking economy, the price to be paid was now unmistakable. When cornered, Washington did not choose to escalate with a bigger bomb. They completely changed the game board. They proved that the war of the future isn't just about stealth, but the fusion of stealth, AI drones, hypersonic speed, and global financial weaponry. America had delivered a decisive strike, forcing its two greatest rivals to realize they were playing a game whose rules had been completely rewritten. The storm paused, not because peace was restored, but because all three sides had seen the abyss. The crisis, which began with a silent explosion underground, was now paused by a tense phone call. Three sides on edge. A red hotline connected not just Washington and Beijing, but a triangle of power: Washington, Beijing, and Moscow, established instantly. Beijing faced an unimaginable nightmare. Its economy, the foundation of all its ambitions, was on the brink of total collapse, all from a single decree that froze trillions of dollars in foreign reserves. The B-2 strike had exposed its military weakness. The economic sanctions struck at its Achilles heel. They were forced to make the bitterest choice: to quietly withdraw their naval forces. The de facto blockade around Taiwan had to end. As for the Kremlin, their intervention began loudly, but ended in a calculated silence. They had sent Su-57s into battle, but America's technological counterstrike, the exposure of the Ghost's tracking ability and stealth drones, combined with secondary economic sanctions, forced Putin to recalculate. They realized that an alliance with They weren't silent out of fear. They were silent to redefine the game. The Su-57 squadron quietly returned home. Peace was not restored. An unofficial Cold Order 2.0 had begun, an order far more dangerous, more unpredictable, and without clear red lines. What lessons can be drawn from this scenario? First, it reveals the absolute fragility of peace. A single preemptive military action, even one described as surgical and precise, can trigger a chain reaction, pushing all nuclear powers to the brink of annihilation. Second, and the most vital lesson, is the redefinition of deterrence itself. Deterrence in the 21st century is no longer about the number of warheads or aircraft carriers. It is the war of integration. It is the power of legacy platforms like the B-2, combined with artificial intelligence, stealth drones, the domination of space, merged with hypersonic speed, and most fearsome of all, the fusion of military power and global financial weapons. Whoever commands these multi-domain fronts with AI will hold absolute power. For nations caught on the geopolitical chessboard, this scenario reinforces one truth: nothing is impossible in a world where superpowers are willing to break every rule. In such a world, independence, a modern, flexible defense, and a wise foreign policy are no longer options.